The whole concept that large language models, as everybody's familiar with, they're using all the chatbots that people are using today, well, they're so last year. I say that with a bit of tongue-in-cheek humor, but the reality of it is large language models are becoming very last year, and I'll explain why. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Straight Talk on AI. And today I'm actually going to talk about something that is interesting, probably controversial, and it's a topic that even our own team has got into with a bit of emotion behind it. And that is the whole concept that large language models, as everybody's familiar with, they're using all the chatbots that people are using today, well, they're so last year. I say that with a bit of tongue-in-cheek humor, but the reality of it is large language models are becoming very last year, and I'll explain why. A lot of the hype around large language models hasn't faded. In fact, I just recently saw a video from Eric Schmidt. I believe it was a canceled video on YouTube, but somebody did forward it to me. It was narrated, and I quite like the narration of it, and even some of the challenges that the narrator came back on what Eric was saying. Now, Eric was talking to a group of Stanford students, and I understand that he was likely talking to them to get their juices flowing with where this world of AI is going. But there's a lot of things that I also want to challenge around that, and one of them is the concept of large language models. Eric in the video had talked about models getting bigger, these gigantic models. And although we see a lot of the major players, including the Microsofts of the world, OpenAI's, Metas, they're all chasing these bigger models, bigger context windows, more parameters. You've heard it all. And even Eric had indicated becoming friends with Canada in order to gain access to all that energy that's needed to train these models. Now, training is one element, and I've heard this come up with investors and people pitching data centers. It's all about training. In another video, I do want to get people to shift their thought process, not from training, but back onto inferencing, actually using the models for real value. That's a separate topic. But if we go back to these gigantic models, it's certainly not a concept that I would subscribe to, and a lot of others in academia would subscribe to as well. And we are working with some pretty smart folks that believe new designs and new architectures are going to be the way forward. If you look at this concept of just getting bigger and bigger models with more context windows, there is a lot wrong with that. One, it's not sustainable. And a lot of these companies are finding that it's not sustainable. They can't sustain the costs in order to train, never mind the inferencing side of the fence. And it's just getting bigger and bigger and consuming more GPU horsepower and more energy with that. There's a lot of issues around it. One that we've found ourselves. We've been dealing with these models for a long time, many years now. And even we've seen that larger context windows doesn't mean anything. And if you put that in human terms, the more information you get and you throw at something doesn't necessarily get you a better answer. And part of where we have augmented that is we spend a lot of time in what we call contextual cross-retrieval augmentation, to make sure that these large language models get the information that's relevant and pertinent. We also retain the context that Eric talked about in these gigantic models outside of a single large language model. We apply a concept of 1,000 brains. We firmly believe that there's going to be many models applied to any particular problem that needs to be solved, and therefore we need to retain the context independent of the models. And that's part of that contextual cross-retrieval augmentation process that I mentioned earlier. And this is why we can deal with any large language model, and we do not have to get into this, I think, hype cycle of larger and larger is better. The other element around this that's becoming important is, one of the things that Eric said is that the push towards AGI is more of a country level effort. And that means it takes country level investment into building these larger and larger models, given the cost associated with that. And that's something I don't believe in. If you look at innovation across history, never mind in AI, a lot of this is coming from brilliant people that are even in academia. And the world that we're dealing with is a lot of brilliance in research and development within smaller firms, the garage, if you will, but even within academia. Our own chief scientist, Dr. Alipur, is working with academia extensively, does a lot of work with Dr. Fard at the University of British Columbia. And there's an entire concept that they're working on around knowledge distillation. And that's the ability of larger models to train smaller baby models. And the whole concept of smaller baby models is that you can fine-tune, optimize, and continuously train those at a far faster rate than you can with these large, gigantic models. And that knowledge distillation goes a long way. If you apply knowledge distillation with the whole concept of agentic workflow, you can get to some pretty brilliant AI with built-in reasoning, and one that is sustainable. So even though there's a lot of hype around these large language models, even though there's some veracity to what some folks are saying, and these new models are going to get better and better, I certainly don't subscribe to the brute force techniques. And I also want to make sure that AI is sustainable, not just for the country level efforts, but it's sustainable for enterprises. If you're looking at solving very specific issues in your enterprise, in your industry, that is going to require more sustainability. It is going to require more focus on techniques like agentic workflow, improvements in the RAG processes, massive improvements in the multimodal analysis, not just in the LLMs. And that's why I'm saying LLMs are so last year. There's a lot more to the world of AI, and we can dive into that deeper in future episodes.